As we each assemble our stories relating to climate change, we look for actionable knowledge building blocks to help us answer our "is it worth it" and "can I do it" questions introduced in Part 2. These actionable knowledge building blocks are conceptually similar to Lego building blocks, which we'll use in this video to explore the actionable knowledge approach. The idea of actionable knowledge blocks fitting together to form the climate stories that guide our climate decision-making is pretty intuitive. What's not as intuitive is why so little of our collective climate change decision-making is informed by the best available actionable knowledge. We're leaving huge amounts of it on the table when it comes to that decision-making, at least in significant part because there are major barriers that interfere with the simple idea of getting the right climate story elements to the right decision-maker at the right time. Imagine a climate library full of books. Some of those books contain actionable knowledge, and some more than others. Many are only modestly useful in terms of actionable knowledge indicated by the number of blocks. A few are more useful, and some are treasure troves of actionable knowledge. Of course, they're spread all over the library, so without searching them all out, there is no way to collect them all together like this for easier searching and use. But in principle, you get the idea that the climate library contains a pile of actionable knowledge blocks that could advance a lot of climate change decision-making. Actionable knowledge blocks can come from all kinds of sources, and there is no obvious pattern as to where you'll find the most actionable knowledge. Now let's envision the barriers that get in the way of actionable knowledge blocks getting to the person that could use them. From cognitive biases to information overload to siloing, getting actionable knowledge to the right person faces substantial impediments. And it only gets harder as we produce more and more information. We're not only adding to the size of the actionable knowledge pile, but we're also adding more noise and more misinformation from which the actionable knowledge has to be sorted. The last actionable knowledge challenge is that different individuals are building very different stories with their actionable knowledge blocks. Some might be quite simple, some much more complex, but depending on their role, responsibilities, objectives, and more, every individual is in the market for a different combination of actionable knowledge. That is in part attributable to the two questions that all decision makers are asking themselves pretty much all of the time. If these two questions are effectively answered for a decision maker or by a decision maker, it has the potential to change that person's decision making. In some cases, a decision maker may be out looking for this information on their own. In other cases, they're relying on staff, advisors, lawyers, or consultants to find those actionable climate knowledge blocks based on their understanding of the decision maker. If we think about a business person, in this case an electric utility executive, it's easy to identify many of the climate-related variables that you would typically assume the executive is incorporating into the utility's thinking about and responses to climate change. And the same idea applies to all decision makers, from individuals to policymakers. But there is actually far more than that going into how that utility executive is perceiving or could perceive climate change. Depending on the executive's family background and status, training, hobbies, politics, and more, she is likely to be more or less receptive to many of the actionable knowledge building blocks, and more or less likely to end up with a very different climate story at the end of the day. Each of the variables I've identified here could be different for another business person, resulting in the need for a very different combination of actionable knowledge building blocks. So the idea of actionable knowledge is simple enough. Slice and dice climate change information into potentially actionable knowledge blocks to fit many different uses and needs, and reassemble it to fit a specific decision maker's needs. And presumably get more yes answers to our "is it worth it" and "can I do it" questions focused on climate change. How does our typical approach of getting much of our information compare to what I've described for actionable knowledge? Not very well. Given how much information is out there, the Google pond is a tough place to be confident of catching your actionable knowledge dinner. With millions of hits on any topic, finding the information that can best serve as your actionable knowledge can often be a matter of random chance. That brings me in part 4 to the climate web, which is an actionable knowledge information solution. As such, it should be able to advance the goals of anyone investigating climate change for themselves and anyone working to influence other people's climate change decision-making. That includes journalists, researchers, teachers, consultants, and lawyers. Even when an individual knows a lot about climate change, very few people have the information at their disposal to address the actionable knowledge challenge for other people. We often believe that if we tell our climate story often enough, other people will come around, but that's not the way it works. What the climate web does can be thought of as analogous to spearfishing as compared to fishing in the Google pond. It's something that has never been tried before for any wicked problem that we're aware of, and certainly not climate change. Of course, the climate web is not a finished product. It never can be. It's constantly evolving and scaling along with climate change information, and that's part of the power of the software that we're using for the climate web. The information technology we're using is one that turns out almost no one has ever heard of before, even though it is commercially available. The brain software, enormously powerful in its ability to organize information in all kinds of ways, is well suited to the goal of facilitating access to actionable climate knowledge. I'll start to show how in Part 4.